Hey everyone, my name is Stacey Adelman and I'm a registered psychologist and owner and founder of Joshua Tree Learning Center here in Regina, Saskatchewan. So every Tuesday at 12, I go live on Facebook and we talk about a variety of different topics. So today, I really wanted to dive into learning disabilities. So before I became a psychologist, I was a teacher for several years. I taught elementary, middle years, and a little bit into the high school area as well. And did that for quite some time and thoroughly enjoyed it. And the area that I really specialized in after, as a regular classroom teacher, I moved more into working with kids with learning challenges, all kinds of learning challenges, and a lot with kids with learning disabilities or diagnosed learning disabilities. And so I thought, you know what, let's just talk a little bit today about learning disabilities and maybe present a bit of an overview of what they are, as I feel there can be some misunderstandings about exactly what a learning disability is, what that means for our kids or for adults who have diagnosed learning disabilities, and what are perhaps some things we as parents can do to help kids who have learning disabilities. So let's just start off pretty basic here. What is a learning disability? So essentially, when it comes to learning, some individuals are basically just wired a little bit differently. So it's a neurodevelopmental type of disorder in the brain that affects learning. Now, what is really important to understand with learning disabilities is that it's actually only diagnosed in individuals that have average to above average cognitive ability. So, again, when we look at the term learning disability, sometimes the assumption is made that maybe an individual has lower cognitive ability. That's not true. In order to have a diagnosed learning disability, there has to be average to above average IQ or cognitive ability, but for some reason, the individual is achieving only at a much lower level. So, quite a significant lower level than what we might expect given their cognitive ability. So, for example, cognitive ability might be here, but achievement is lower than that. So, our question is, well, why this gap? Right. And usually there's some issue in the neurodevelopmental kind of processes to learning that are causing some of this gap. There might be a problem with one or with several. And so that is essentially when we diagnose a learning disability, we're trying to figure all of that out. So, what causes an LD or a learning disability? Essentially, it's genetics or something an individual is born with. Um, Potentially, it could be because of an injury, but usually we see it as something as just, again, it's biological in nature and something an individual is just kind of born with it. And there may be a genetic predisposition to that or not. Um, but essentially, what it does is it really impacts learning. Now, how does it impact learning? It can impact it in several ways. So, for example, a learning disability might be mild, um, moderate, or severe. It's going to affect individuals differently, and it's going to show up differently in different people. Um, it may show up more at home more at school than at home, for example. Or if it's more severe, you might see it showing up in multiple different settings. It's probably always affecting them in different settings, but it's just showing up a little bit more. Again, is it possible for somebody to have a disability, a learning disability in just math, for example? Yes. But it's also possible to have a learning disability in reading, writing, and math. So there's a lot of variations in how this wiring or how this learning disability is affecting the individual. How is a learning disability diagnosed? You will need to get a diagnosis with a registered psychologist who has the competency to diagnose a learning disorder or learning disability. And essentially, what's going to happen in that assessment is there will be a cognitive portion of that assessment because we need to determine the individual's ability level. And then there's also what we call an achievement portion of that as well for that individual to see exactly where are they performing in reading, writing, and math are the areas we take a look at. And once we gather that information, we're able to closely analyze the individual's learning profile and their ability level and their achievement level and try to kind of figure things out. As well, what we're going to measure in that assessment would be their attention and focus, their executive functioning, and we'd also want to take a look at their emotions and mood and things like that to see if things like depression or anxiety are present. So there's a lot that kind of goes into it that we need to work with and figure out to determine if we are in fact looking at a learning disability, because it's really important that we understand that there are other factors that affect learning. So for example, if somebody has missed a lot of school, for example, it makes it difficult to determine if there's a learning disability there because the discrepancy in learning may be just because somebody is absent, right? They've had a lot of holes in learning. So we have to really look at the cognitive learning profile to determine if there's in fact a learning disability there, and to what degree, if there's been absences, to what degree that's affected the learning as well. So there's a lot of factors to consider before we actually make a diagnosis of a learning disability. So, what are some potential flags for a learning disability? How might a parent know if there's, a learning disability or a potential learning disability in their child? So one of the key things I would look at right away as a teacher, for example, is if a student was doing really well in most areas, but then there was one area, maybe it was math, that wasn't quite a struggle, or the mark was quite a bit lower than the other marks, then that's typically a flag that there's something going on there that we might want to take a closer look at. The other thing we need to think of is if the individual is in school and they're getting a lot of what we call a response to intervention or a lot of support at school, are we seeing a lot of growth with it? What kind of growth? How many supports are needed? How much effort is that individual putting into their schoolwork and maybe just not getting the process or the progress rather that we might expect. So you want to take a note of that maybe we're looking at a learning disability and we got to do things a little bit differently. That could be something. If you're looking in specific subject areas, typically with reading or with writing, we're going to find individuals perhaps are having difficulty with their sounds. They might be experiencing difficulties, for example, with b and d, or um, p and b, for example. That would be kind of some of those auditory processing difficulties. Maybe there's difficulties with rhyming, difficulties with blending, spelling, or fluency, right? Maybe they're learning to read, but they're having difficulty pulling it all together and becoming a really fluent reader. We'll also see that in writing. You might see difficulties with that. A lot of times I hear parents they'll say, well, my kids are really reversing letters. And that can certainly be a flag. You tend to see B and D reversals, for example. And that's typically normal into the elementary years. You're going to see that. If that is extending into the higher grades, maybe more towards grade 4, 5, 6, then it's like, okay, we should developmentally be seeing that kind of fade out a little bit. That might be a potential flag, but that's not the only flag for a reading disability. So you want to pay attention to their phonetic ability. Are they able to sound words out? Are they able to get the meaning of what they're reading? Or are they having to reread continuously to try to derive meaning from what they're reading? But most often we'll tend to see it a lot in like blending, rhyming, and sound recognition. Um, in writing, sometimes kids will have just a lot of difficulty writing or completing a thought, or a lot of times it's just in their spelling, right? Again, there's that phonetic piece that's kind of being pulled into it. In math, we typically see it in maybe their math fluency or their calculation and difficulty with those kinds of tasks, or in their ability, like in their applied problems or their ability to problem solve, right? So you may see quite a discrepancy there. So again, it can show up very differently. And as I always say to parents, you know what, if you have a gut instinct with something, I think you can trust that. And the parent's gut just kind of knows. And I think I would encourage you to talk with your child's teacher or with a psychologist if you're interested in that. So something to kind of be aware of. Again, we want to be sure that when we're diagnosing a learning disability, that what interventions have been done. So, has there been tutoring support or the response to intervention plans at school? For example, what kinds of strategies have been in place? Are they working with a learning resource teacher or LLI, for example? Are they in these programs to trying to develop these reading skills? And again, we just might not be seeing the growth that we might expect given the more intensive kind of interventions that have been applied. Those would typically be a flag. All right. How do learning disabilities affect maybe a social emotional development? So essentially, if kids are starting to get frustrated or feel really anxious about their learning, that's when I, would encourage you to maybe investigate it a little bit more, because it can be extremely frustrating to be working extremely hard and not getting, kind of the outcome you are hoping for when you're learning a new task. So it can be really frustrating. It just takes a lot of mental energy when you're struggling with a task. Um, it can affect them at school. You will tend to see some kids becoming a bit self-conscious. They don't like, to show that they're struggling. So they, might try to cover that up a little bit. Again, the frustration or feeling behind, that can really take a bit of a toll. And then later in life, as in adults, we tend to see it showing up in the workplace a little bit. So in the same kinds of ways, but um, you know, as an adult would kind of experience that frustration or difficulty. So how do we provide support to kids that do have a diagnosed learning disability? Well, the way I see it is I feel like once we know that we have a diagnosed learning disability, I always try to think of it as, we just have to do things differently. They're very, very capable of learning. Their cognitive ability is really good. In fact, a lot of research shows that individuals with diagnosed learning disabilities are very good at learning to be flexible thinkers and learning how to adapt because they've had to do that as a coping strategy. And so the key thing we need to remember with kids with learning disabilities is they are capable. We need to maintain high expectations for them because they're capable of learning that material. We need to get creative and maybe take a different route when teaching them or supporting them. So we may want to look at, well, how can we do things differently? So there's a part where, yeah, we do want to remediate. We certainly want to provide intensive instruction for individuals with learning disabilities because they're capable of learning it. It might be taking them longer. It might be more difficult. So you want our instruction to be really um, clear, very direct instruction, and you want it to be really multisensory. So think of your five senses and how can we get that information in using the five senses. So really trying to keep it a multisensory, clear, structured, direct learning or teaching approach when working with kids. We also want to consider then, sorry, the final thing I'll say about that before I forget is that you want to make it really meaningful. So again, when we're struggling to learn something new, I want to know how the heck this is going to apply to my life, right? Because otherwise the motivation to learn something really difficult goes down. So as much as possible, try to connect it to something really meaningful to that individual and to that child. Show them how they're going to be using that in their life. So that one piece is remediation. We also need to consider maybe assistive technology or accommodations. So accommodations does not mean we are letting them out of it. It means I can travel from Regina to Saskatoon, but there's lots of different highways to go to Saskatoon. I don't always have to take the same highway. The expectation to get to Saskatoon is still there, but I might take this highway, I might take this highway. There's a million different highways that we can explore to get to our destination. And that's how we have to think creatively as educators and as parents to help our kids with diagnosed learning disabilities, because they are very capable of meeting their goals. So sometimes we can do that through doing things differently, and that might be with technology, or it might be an example of an accommodation might be, hey, when I'm writing this test, if I have a diagnosed writing disability, I don't want to give that kid necessarily a test where they have to write the answers for their science test, because the writing is in fact the barrier. So let's take the barrier out of the way and let them verbalize what they know about volcanoes or what they know about plants, right? Maybe we do a voice to text kind of a program. There's so many great technologies available now where we can upload exams and have kids do a complete test verbally. So they have great verbal skills. Let them use their strengths to tell us what they know. So that would be an example of an accommodation. We are not making it easier. We're eliminating the barrier so that the individual can share with us what they know. So accommodations, assistive technology, and remediation would be key to helping kids who have diagnosed learning disabilities. I think we need to keep talking about identifying kids who do have learning disabilities. I think we need to keep talking about different strategies and supports that can best help kids with learning disabilities, because again, they have a lot to offer us. They have great cognitive ability, amazing ideas, incredible flexibility, and we need that in this world. So we need to get creative on how best to meet the needs of people with learning disabilities. So again, we offer some services here at Joshua Tree specifically to help kids with learning disabilities. We have a tutor here. Her name is Joan Helmsing, and Joan is fantastic. She was a learning resource teacher for 30 years in Regina Public Schools, working extensively with kids with all kinds of learning challenges and learning disabilities. And she was then a registered educational psychologist who diagnoses kids with learning disabilities as well. So she's got an extremely thorough understanding of kids who learn differently. And she provides the one-on-one tutoring support for, here at Joshua Tree. So we all work collaboratively as a team in terms of assessment and providing that one-on-one, very clear, direct instruction. For individuals with learning disabilities, we also provide support for parents to help you better understand your child's learning disability and how you can be of support and guidance. And we collaborate closely with with schools if necessary. We're more than happy to be a part of that team planning. So Joshua Tree Learning Center is very committed to working with the community, working with individuals and with families to better understand learning. And so that's it for today. Kind of a quick overview about learning disabilities. Again, if you have any questions, please send them our way. We're more than happy to help and try to answer your questions. And I will see you next Tuesday at 12. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Take care.